Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. There wasn't even time for him to tremble. Under the power of the mysterious fourth finger strike, he collapsed into ashen sparks that attempted to flee. The mysterious energy continued to pursue the ash and wipe it away, but it was tenacious and moments later, formed back into holy extermination. This time, his eyes flickered with fear as he once again fled. However, there was no way for him to escape his fate of death. The mysterious energy smashed at him again, reducing him to ashes yet another time. When the ashes formed back into a human shape again, holy extermination was far weaker than before. This process repeated itself over and over again. Before long, his legs could not reform, nor his arms or legs. Eventually, the only thing that remained was half of his torso and his head. I refuse to accept this. He howled bitterly. Moments before, he had been only a step away from succeeding and becoming eternal. But now, it was in completely unexpected fashion that he found himself crushed in defeat. Then, even as his head was on the verge of fading away, he looked over at Bai Xiaochun in the eternal immortal domains, his eyes shining in profoundly sinister nature. If I can't succeed, then I'll just let another Allheaven rise from the eternal spirit world. Allheaven is supposed to be merciless, but you have too many connections. How could you truly be Allheaven? Well, I guess I'll provide you with the help you need. Henceforth, you will be merciless and unfeeling. You will have no family or friends. Your past will be buried, and you will be baptized by pitilessness. Then, as Allheaven, you will exterminate the never-ending Tao domain. As holy extermination laughed madly, an unprecedentedly dark beam of light shot out of his eyes. Instantly, that black light shot toward the eternal immortal domains. As it neared, it spiraled out to create a massive vortex down below. Intense rumbling sounds mixed with cries of alarm from the people below as the mysterious energy then swept over to wipe it out of existence. But holy extermination knew that he couldn't destroy the eternal immortal domains. After all, resurrecting people of lower cultivation levels than oneself was not an impossibility, so killing the people of the lands would do little to advance his purposes. Therefore, his goal was not destruction. It was something else. By giving my boundless life force as the price, and by using the three great domain treasures of the vast expanse Tao domain, I will open the river of time and space. As his voice caused the starry sky to tremble, the vortex spun madly, moving faster and faster until three objects became visible within them. One was a feng shui compass, one was a black pearl, and one was a white pearl. All three of them radiated a completely ancient air, and caused the vortex around them to whip into a complete frenzy. My three domain treasures were sealed for all eternity, and cannot be unleashed in full. But they are definitely enough to cause the river of time and space to open. As holy extermination's voice echoed out, it began to stretch and distort. Simultaneously, the vortex seemed to be opening a way into a strange and indescribable world, causing the starry sky and all the ruins that filled it to be cast into complete chaos. Beneath the eternal immortal domains, and within the vortex, a huge river could be seen, surging with huge waves. As soon as the river became visible, a massive force of attraction sprang up, grabbing the eternal immortal domains and pulling them down into the river. The river contained a familiar, mysterious energy, and a sensation of the eternal. It contained time itself, as well as an infinitude of essences. It was wholly beyond compare, as if it were the most important thing within the entire starry sky. As Bai Xiaochun realized what was happening, his eyes went wide, and his mind began to reel. No, he shouted madly, blue veins bulging out on his neck and face, his body shaking. Unfortunately, he was simply too weak to even move, let alone stop what was happening. This is my gift to you, Allheaven. Don't even think about trying to bring them back. They are now sealed within the river of time and space. In all creation, including the 9 great Tao domains, I've never heard of a single person who could pull an entire world out of the river of time and space. Chuckling, holy extermination faded away. As for that enormous holy river, and the eternal immortal domains, they also faded away. Everything went silent, the river of time and space was gone, and holy extermination was dead. Everything was over. The starry sky was quiet now, and the frozen 1,080,000 ruins were unsealed. Light began to shine everywhere. However, in the spot where the eternal immortal domains had once existed, Bai Xiaochun hovered, looking down blankly at where the river had just been. He couldn't think. It was almost as if he had become an empty person, technically alive, but essentially dead. Soulless. After a long moment passed, he coughed up a mouthful of blood and then collapsed into unconsciousness. If it weren't for the fact that his lips still quivered a bit, as though he were talking to himself, he would easily be taken for a corpse, drifting forever through the starry sky. Although the 1,080,000 ruins all shone with bright light, he was the only person left, unconscious, directionless. Time passed, although it was impossible to determine how much. Eventually, Bai Xiaochun woke up. Before he could open his eyes, he heard voices calling out to him. "You're finally awake, Daddy. Look, I'm all grown up." Daddy, Xiao had a cultivation base breakthrough. She's a celestial now. Father, I want to get married. As soon as Bai Xiaochun heard the voices of his children, a smile broke out on his face. He also heard warm, tender voices speaking to him that he knew were Song Junwan, Zhou Zimo, Hu Xiaomei and Gongsun Waner. There was also another female voice, somewhat unfamiliar. "Xiaochun, it's me, Du Lingfei." As the voices joined together, Bai Xiaochun felt as though countless eyes were locked onto him, all of them smiling. He could sense Uncle Li, the Grand Heaven Master, the Giant Ghost King, Big Fatty Zhang, Song Ke, Master God Diviner, and others. He was content. He felt the sun shining on him, and could smell the fragrant odor of spring. Everyone was healthy and happy. Although he didn't want to, he eventually opened his eyes. There he floated in the starry sky, tears streaming down his cheeks. The voices vanished. The only thing he could see now was the starry sky, which was completely and utterly quiet. Eventually, he righted himself, looked around, and began to travel through the starry sky until he was back where the eternal immortal domains had once existed. He began to weep. "I defeated the mortal renegade, only to lose everything else." As his tears fell down into the starry sky, he reached out to grasp at something, but there was nothing there. He wanted to take some alcohol out of his bag of holding, but didn't have any to take out. He could only hover there in the starry sky, blank, thinking about the past. One day he looked up, madness flickering in his eyes as he performed an incantation gesture. Unleashing the power of the time immemorial codex, he shifted time and vanished. However, it didn't take long before he returned. Not even using his time-shifting abilities were any help in locating the eternal immortal domains. Apparently, when something entered the river of time and space, all traces of its existence were completely removed. "The river of time and space," he said gratingly. His voice seemed to contain boundless grief that could not be dispelled, neither with tears nor anything else. And thus, the pain inside of him built up to the point where even his voice changed. "They've been sealed in the river of time and space, but they're not dead. If holy extermination can open it, then so can I." Panting, he unleashed the power of his cultivation base and began to try various methods to access the river. He tried to use the essence of the eternal and its mysterious energy, but soon realized that with the departure of the eternal flower, that mysterious energy was vastly weaker. It might as well have not been there. Without its original source, the essence of the eternal was almost useless. The starry sky was bright now, but with the eternal flower gone, Bai Xiaochun was the only living being in existence. And thus, the essence of the eternal had faded. However, he was not ready to give up. He performed test after test, wearing himself ragged in the process. Nothing worked. In the end, he still had no idea how to open the river of time and space. Although he was in pain, he was not in complete despair. He closed his eyes to think for a while, and when he opened them, they shone with more determination than ever. "If the sovereign realm isn't strong enough to open it," he murmured, "then maybe it means I have to reach the eternal realm." Supposedly, absorbing the eternal flower was the only way to reach the eternal realm. But during his fight with the mortal renegade, he had controlled the mysterious energy that was the essence of the eternal, and had thus come to realize that there were definitely other ways. The essence of the eternal is contained in all living things. It is in all essences. Although it is weak, it is always there. If hosts of living beings could exist in the starry sky again, and begin to practice cultivation, then cultivators would multiply, and the essence of the eternal would appear again. If the eternal doesn't exist now, then I'll create it. As living beings awaken and life force spreads, essence will appear. If enlightenment of one essence isn't enough, I'll study 10 of them. 100, 1,000, 10,000. If I have to, I'll understand the essence of all living things in all 1,080,000 worlds in the starry sky. After combining all of the essences, I can reach the eternal realm. Eyes shining with near hysteria, he decided that this was definitely his only option. Turning to look in the direction of the former eternal immortal domains, he spoke in a voice filled with ultimate focus. "The eternal immortal domains. My home. All of you, just wait for me. I promise I'll find you. There is a force which exists in all people. In some, it can be abundant without limit. In others, it can be scarce to the extreme. It can propel some people to the point of shaking heaven and earth, and in other people, it can weaken them to the point of collapsing forever. It can give rise to endless determination, or it can remove it in an instant. That force comes from focus. Bai Xiaochun's focus, his obsession, was to extract the eternal immortal domains from the river of time and space. It was a focus that bordered on insanity, and instantly became the most important aspect of his life. If there is no eternal, then I will create it. If there is no essence, then I will create it. If there is no life, then I will create it. As he looked in the direction where the eternal immortal domains had once existed, his eyes shone with profound light. Eventually, he closed his eyes and settled down cross-legged in the middle of the starry sky. In the past, it had never occurred to him to wonder why there had been sunlight within the body of the arch-ancestor. Nor had he considered why the eternal immortal domains had a sun and a moon, even though the starry sky was pitch black. He hadn't even thought about such things after becoming an Archean. Upon becoming a sovereign, he qualified to understand such matters, but because of the fight with the mortal renegade, he had never had the time. But now, here in the middle of the starry sky, he began to ponder the subject. Whether it was the heavenspan realm or the eternal immortal domains, it was all the same. All suns and moons inside of the eternal flower were provided by the eternal mother. And that was because life requires sunlight, he murmured. His eyes opened, and his left eye began to shine with brilliant light that quickly came to resemble that of a sun. That light, of course, came from the forefather transformation that he had cultivated many years ago. Now that he had reached the sovereign realm, it was boundlessly bright. First, it spread out through the starry sky to touch all of the 1,080,000 worlds, where the light then formed into numerous glowing spheres. They were suns. There were now 1,080,000 suns, all of which were also Bai Xiaochun's left eye. The presence of the suns completely changed the starry sky, and caused all of the 1,080,000 sets of ruins to tremble physically. And yet, things weren't over yet. Bai Xiaochun's right eye now began to glow, but this time with something much softer, moonlight. If the 1,080,000 worlds had suns, how could they go without moons? 1,080,000 moons formed, and the combination of the suns and moons gave night and day to the starry sky. The sun and moon in the eternal immortal domains were illusory constructions provided by the eternal mother. As for these suns and moons, they were not illusory, they were real, and they were Bai Xiaochun's eyes. With suns and moons, with night and day, all that is needed now are seeds, the seeds of life. Bai Xiaochun didn't move, but the life force within him formed into seeds that began to drift out of him and fly toward the 1,080,000 worlds. Bai Xiaochun remained in place, cross-legged. He would not rise to his feet again, but instead, would stay there guarding the spot where his home had vanished. However, his eyes filled the starry sky. And if he wanted, he could appear anywhere. Years passed. The suns and moons in the myriad of worlds in the starry sky continued their dance. Eventually, the various ruins began to show signs of life. The seeds that Bai Xiaochun had planted were already beginning to grow. 100,000 years passed. Blue seas turned into mulberry fields. Suns rose, and moons set. The battle of years past was nothing but ancient history. And no one had been alive to witness it, making it nearly unreal. In fact, no one even knew about Bai Xiaochun. His name was a thing of the past. The 1,080,000 sets of ruins in the eternal spirit world were changing. Rains and winds touched them, and because of Bai Xiaochun's abundant life force, the crumbled buildings and structures had long since collapsed into dust and disappeared into nothing. One day, on one of those former ruined worlds, the first living things appeared. They were small, so small that they were invisible to the naked eye. They would even be difficult to detect with divine sense. They were not conscious, and were extremely small and weak. But they were abundant. Apparently, they had come to exist because of the sunlight itself, and before long, they were not just on one world. One by one, living things appeared in all of the 1,080,000 worlds. They did not have any specific shape, and in fact, were difficult to describe with words. But they were there. Even in the former location of the eternal immortal domains, where Bai Xiaochun sat cross-legged in meditation, those living things came to be. Because of the birth of these living things, the starry sky changed. It was no longer dead and still. Instead, life force began to build. The suns and moons that were Bai Xiaochun's eyes took note of them, and watched for tens of thousands of years, as they changed the 1,080,000 sets of ruins. At this point, they weren't really ruins anymore. Life had returned to the 1,080,000 worlds, and there was no trace of any wreckage or rubble. In fact, because of the rain that had long since begun to fall, many of the worlds had seas and oceans. Some of the worlds even had hills and areas where dust had congealed into mud. One day, tiny bacteria appeared within the depths of one of those oceans, which began to grow and spread through the water. In different worlds, the living things bore different appearances. For example, there were some worlds with no oceans, with the only water existing in deep mud. It was from that mud that the living beings emerged. When the first living things came to exist, Bai Xiaochun appeared. He looked down into the water, then waved his hand to pull up some of the bacteria. After examining them, he closed his eyes. Soon, very soon, he vanished, and the bacteria he had picked up floated back down into the ocean. Bacteria continued to thrive in the following years. The oceans changed, the lands changed, and the worlds changed. Soon, all of the 1,080,000 worlds pulsed with life force. In some worlds, the sky was azure, and the sun and moon shone dazzlingly. The clouds which rolled across the skies of such worlds would entrance anyone who could have seen them. In some worlds, lightning crashed, and black clouds filled the skies. Although it was an awe-inspiring sight, it was the perfect environment for the living things there. Some worlds were parched and hot, but at the same time, were perfect places for living things to thrive. Within the 1,080,000 worlds were all sorts of living creatures, and all sorts of natural laws. Countless essences came into being, all of which conformed to the magical laws that governed life in general. Bai Xiaochun watched the worlds, and studied the living beings that were multiplying there. Several tens of thousands of years passed. Eventually, new types of beings came to exist within the various worlds. These beings had no bones, and were soft-bodied. Some had shells, others did not, and they looked strange and bizarre. Some of them were aggressive, while others were completely passive. There were some who would vanish if they were simply touched. However, the existence of these new beings brought a splash of color to what had once been a very monotonous starry sky. More years passed, until finally, plants appeared in one of the worlds. The first plant was tiny, and bore a passing semblance to grass. It was about the size of a human fingernail, and if one could have looked closely at it, they would have seen tiny veins spreading out to fill its interior. Bai Xiaochun appeared near the plant, knelt down, and looked at it. It was weak, but tenacious, and when he sensed the life flowing through it, he smiled for the first time in a long time. Soon, very, very soon, time continued to pass. The presence of plants seemed to mark the beginning of a new age. In different worlds, the plants would be different colors and shapes, and would behave differently due to the different magical laws. But in the end, they were all still plants. Countless varieties of plants. Plants filled the oceans and the lands, the mountains and the hills. Everything. Over the course of the following tens of thousands of years, the sun shone down onto the bacteria, soft-bodied creatures, and plants, who were now the rulers of the various worlds that filled the starry sky. Eventually, fish appeared in the oceans, as well as creatures who could live on the shores of the waters but could not venture far from it. One day, Bai Xiaochun's eyes, out in the starry sky, spotted what looked like frogs or toads, and yet, were different from either of those animals. Eventually, lizard-like animals appeared in the grasslands. The suns that were Bai Xiaochun's eyes glittered in response. In that moment, all living creatures within the starry sky suddenly heard a voice speaking in their souls. Very soon, when that voice spoke, all of the plants stretched toward the sky, and all of the animals looked up. Even the fish stopped moving. Although the strange moment soon passed, all of the living beings had been touched, marked in a way that would stay with them and their descendants forever, even as they went about their lives of eating and hunting for food. The wheel of time continued to turn for 100,000 years. Or perhaps it was 1 million. Maybe longer. As the animals in the worlds flourished, flying creatures eventually appeared, who soared in the air above the lands they lived in. The appearance of birds seemed to mark yet another new age. Then, even newer animals began to appear, animals that were not born from eggs. They were more active and intelligent than anything which had come before, and were truly causing the starry sky to awaken. Over the endless years that followed, innumerable types of living creatures appeared in the worlds in the starry sky. They struggled and fought amongst each other for supremacy, with the weaker ones disappearing, and the stronger ones surviving. Bai Xiaochun would occasionally observe, and one day, noticed a monkey-like creature using a rock to fight its enemies. Eventually, such creatures realized that moving about on all fours was not convenient when using rocks in that manner, and thus, took to standing on two legs. At that point, Bai Xiaochun's expression shone with unprecedented brightness. He watched as these two-legged creatures began to live in groups, and hunt in organized fashion. Then one day, lightning struck a tree near some of them, and their eyes flickered with fear from the resulting fire. However, now that they had learned to use simple weapons, they became the ultimate domineering force on that world. Such groups of advanced living beings appeared in one world after another. In each of these worlds, the dominant groups of creatures came from different origins. Some started out as monkeys, others as birds. Others rose from living stone, and others were creatures of the air itself. There were all types of beings in the worlds, all of whom sprang forth from the natural laws which governed them. Bai Xiaochun didn't just observe passively. Although he didn't encourage any of them to begin using weapons, he did help them to take fire away from the burning trees which were struck by lightning. He helped the flying creatures learn to use the power of the wind to their advantage. He helped the stone-like creatures understand what it meant to build structures. He was always there to guide them, until they started to develop intelligence. What is wisdom and intelligence? He thought on one dark night as he stood on a mountain, looking down into a valley at a group of savages crouched around a fire, wearing animal skins and shouting loudly. Although there was clearly nothing civilized about them, the delight in their eyes as they stared into the fire caused Bai Xiaochun to sink into a state of thoughtfulness. Eventually, he waved his hand toward the fire, which suddenly raged to life, startling the surrounding humans. Trembling, they scattered into the darkness. After a moment passed, one of the savages crept forward, pointing at the fire and crying out in incredulity. In response, other savages crept back and looked more closely at the fire, where they realized a shadowy figure was visible. He wore a long robe, the likes of which they had never seen before. He had long hair, and was very tall. As he stood there in the fire, he looked off into the distance. He was none other than a projection of Bai Xiaochun. He was interested in seeing how these savages, these progenitors of humankind, would react to seeing a shadowy form inside of the fire. The first savage to have noticed him in the fire was also the first to drop to his knees, crawl forward, and then begin to bow in fanatical worship. Other savages followed, and soon, all of them were bowing zealously. At this point, Bai Xiaochun had gained the information he sought, and the figure in the flames began to fade away. When it vanished, the flames leapt higher, illuminating the sky, and casting terror into the hearts of the wild beasts in the surrounding mountains and valleys. From that point on, that group of savages would always stare into the fire with respect. And when they went on hunts, they would collect small, valuable items, which they would toss into the fire. The savages would look on with shining eyes as such sacrifices were transformed into ash, and then, they would drop down and worship. The first of the savages to have seen the image in the fire eventually took the sap of trees and plants and drew a picture on himself to represent fire. He quickly rose to a position of authority within that group of savages, a scene which Bai Xiaochun found to be particularly relevant. All of a sudden, certain matters clicked in his mind. Wisdom and intelligence begin with imagination. Imagination can turn a rock into a weapon. Imagination can turn fire into a way to drive away darkness. Imagination can make gods to worship and form them into totems. When you take imagination and combine it with action, you have the first sprout of wisdom and intelligence. Bai Xiaochun looked at the savages one last time, then closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he was in another world, where he began to guide the imaginations of the countless groups of living beings that now existed. Time passed. As Bai Xiaochun guided the living beings of the 1,080,000 worlds, their imaginations eventually led them to believe in the existence of heaven and earth. And eventually, Bai Xiaochun came to be a deity to them. As the hosts of living beings developed, their life essence also grew. And because of the marks that were branded on their souls, Bai Xiaochun was always with them. Different peoples had different deities that they would worship. Some people worshipped the sun. Others called their god the creator. Others called him the sky deity. Different names existed among different peoples. The Almighty, God the Father, the Stone Ancestor, the Wind Spirit, and many more. The people in the various worlds continued to grow strong, and as certain groups reached the pinnacle of life, civilization came to be. Civilization looked different on different worlds. Some places had cities and buildings, which were organized into countries. Others were clan-based. Others were completely unique. Some civilizations took to the skies, and lorded it over the lands. Others ruled from the land. Every conceivable type of civilization came to be, and flourished. However, regardless of what type of living beings they were, or how their civilization advanced, they all reached a point where they wanted to be closer to their god. They wanted mystical power, and even the ability to become gods themselves. And when that happened, it was time for Bai Xiaochun to yet again appear, to provide the final bit of guidance, and the final beginning. And thus, the concept of cultivation became a host of seeds that floated out into the starry sky. A few thousand years later, all of the peoples of all of the worlds had mystical powers. A new cultivation world had come to be in the eternal spirit world. After providing the last bit of guidance, Bai Xiaochun didn't pay any further attention to the living beings in the multitude of worlds in the starry sky. He sat down cross-legged in the place where the eternal immortal domains had disappeared, which, over the years, had gradually become a landmass. Bai Xiaochun closed his eyes, and as the years passed, and he remained completely motionless, he became a statue. During the process in which life had sprang up from nothing and eventually reached a flourishing state, Bai Xiaochun never once felt the essence of the eternal, or the mysterious energy. After the eternal flower fell into the river of time and space, the essence of the eternal faded so much that, perhaps it had vanished completely. After the creation of life, Bai Xiaochun murmured, the next step, is enlightenment of essence. With that, he sent his divine sense out into the starry sky, and began to seek enlightenment from the natural laws that had risen up along with the countless living beings. Years ago, his Tao had been that of lighting up the starry sky to become a sovereign. And he had accomplished that. In fact, he had gone beyond bringing light to the starry sky, he had also brought life back to it. But now, he wasn't concerned about his cultivation base. He needed to understand the essence of all of the multitude of worlds in the starry sky, and then use that understanding to make the eternal. Wait for me, all of you. It will be soon, very soon. As time passed, he became a part of the starry sky itself as he sought the enlightenment he needed. This time, it wasn't 10,000 years that passed. Nor was it 1 million. It was longer than that. Eventually, it reached the point of being incalculable. Among the 1,080,000 worlds in the starry sky, Bai Xiaochun was ancient history, whose existence would only be mentioned in the most ancient of records. As generations came and went, people stopped believing in the old legends about the origin of cultivation. People began to believe that their cultivation came from their own power. The seeds that Bai Xiaochun had scattered years ago were forgotten by the people of the starry sky. They created new techniques, divine abilities, and schools of magic. The cultivation world thrived, and wars were fought. Years and years passed. Countless talented individuals spent their lives studying the practice of cultivation, noting their errors and mistakes, and passing on information to further generations. Eventually, by building on the failures of past generations, a celestial arose, the first within the 1,080,000 worlds. That celestial obtained the approval of the world in which he lived, and tried to do something completely grand and dramatic, something that no one before him had ever done. He tried to break out from the world in which he lived, to step into the starry sky. Sadly, despite spending his whole life in that attempt, and using up all the resources he had managed to accumulate, he failed. But eventually, more celestials appeared among the various peoples of the various worlds. The cultivation world in this starry sky had entered the age of celestials. All celestials dreamed of leaving the worlds they came from and of stepping out into that starry sky. After all, they were convinced that the only way to become more than a celestial was to seek a path in what was beyond the heavens they knew. Unfortunately, none of those celestials succeeded. No matter how spectacular they were, when they reached the limits of the heavens, they could do nothing more than take half a step into the starry sky. More years passed. As more and more celestials appeared, eventually, one of them reached the Archean realm. He was an old man, and when he achieved his breakthrough, the sound of his laughter filled his world. Everyone watched in envy and excitement as he floated up toward the limits of the sky. I, Sima Nan, have finally broken through. This is the legendary Archean realm. Laughing heartily, he flew up and stepped out into the starry sky. The starry sky. The starry sky. As he hovered there, he looked around, both excited and filled with ambition. His goal? To see the whole starry sky with his own eyes, to search it and find out if other worlds existed. In the years to follow, he would indeed appear in one world after another. The cultivation world had entered the era of the starry sky. As the first Archean in the starry sky, he spent more than 1,000 years traveling amongst worlds. He visited over 10 of them. Considering how powerful his cultivation base was, it was easy for him to conquer them. However, he couldn't take the people of the world away with him, nor could he bring people from his home world there to colonize them. Therefore, he would plunder the worlds he conquered, and then move on. The excitement of conquering worlds soon faded. However, in the calm that came afterward, he came to be convinced that he was the ultimate existence within this starry sky. Unless another Archean appeared, he was definitely the most powerful expert there was. Being invincible is actually fairly lonesome, he thought, sighing. He was currently sitting cross-legged on a huge sword made of bone, flying through the starry sky, looking for another world to explore. Suddenly, he turned to look in a different direction. Over there, is something calling out to me. He frowned. This was his first time experiencing anything like this within the starry sky. Confident in the level of his cultivation base, he chuckled coldly and began to head in the direction of the call. Let's see who or what dared to try to summon me. Eyes shining with lofty coldness, he proceeded along for an entire 60-year cycle. Sometimes he would grow suspicious about the situation, and about how far away this call was coming from. Just what exactly is calling to me, he thought, frowning. Soon, he realized that something strange was happening. The call was actually coming, not from some distant location, but from within his soul. Something was urging his soul to travel to some specific location. However, Sima Nan still felt confident in his cultivation base, and therefore, continued onward at full speed. The location he was being called to wasn't actually as far away as he had thought. After another 60-year cycle passed, he noticed a landmass some distance away in the starry sky. Don't tell me this awful place is another world? He looked around, chuckling coldly. During the past 2 60-year cycles, the urgings of his soul had come to be quite annoying to him. Sending divine sense out, he confirmed that there was nothing dangerous in the area, and then continued on toward the landmass. As Sima Nan landed on the continent, it was to his surprise that he didn't find any life at all. And yet, the thirst within his soul actually grew more intense. He was feeling extremely suspicious about the whole thing, but had spent 2 60-year cycles to get to this place, and knew he couldn't just look around briefly and then leave. After a moment of thought, his eyes turned cold, and he blurred into motion, following the tugging of his soul deep into the landmass. Eventually, he caught sight of a mountain. It was actually the only mountain on the entire landmass, and at its peak was a statue of a person, seated cross-legged in meditation. The instant Sima Nan saw that statue, he shivered, and his mind began to spin. That statue. That statue. His soul was shivering in much the same way that a child would when catching sight of his father. Unable to control himself, Sima Nan flew over to the statue and dropped down to kowtow to it. To his utter shock, he recognized this statue. It was very similar to statues he had seen among his own people, and even in the peoples of the other worlds he had visited. And it was connected to a legend that only a few people knew of. As for those who had heard of the legend, they all assumed it was a fairy tale of some sort. Sima Nan had also believed the same thing. Upon realizing that the gods depicted on numerous worlds, including his own, were all the same, he had felt that something strange was going on, but had eventually dismissed such thoughts. But now, upon seeing this statue, all of those old memories resurfaced. Based on the fluctuations of his soul, he knew that the legends were true. This statue had not been placed here by any group or people. Sima Nan could sense that truth based on his cultivation base and his soul. This statue was alive. When standing in front of it, Sima Nan's cultivation base felt completely insignificant. He could tell that, with a single thought, this statue could destroy, not just him, but his entire world. Perhaps even the entire starry sky. This statue was the same person who was mentioned in the legends of the worlds Sima Nan had visited. He was the sun god of ancient times, who was the source of everything that existed. I've seen God, Sima Nan murmured. Trembling, he prostrated himself in front of the statue, and remained there, unmoving. Sima Nan did not leave. After finding the statue of Bai Xiaochun, which he understood to be God, he chose to stay behind and stand guard over it. In fact, he went so far as to officially declare that location hallowed ground within the starry sky. He soon found that there were mysterious properties to the area that aided his cultivation. Time seemed to flow differently there. These facts prompted Sima Nan to excitedly kowtow in worship to the statue. As years passed in which he worshipped Bai Xiaochun and stood guard, he became a much calmer and more peaceful person. However, whenever he looked at the statue, his eyes would burn with unmatchable fervor. And thus, time passed. Eventually, another Archean appeared from within the 1,080,000 worlds, and then a third, and a fourth. Archeans began to appear from within all of the peoples that inhabited the starry sky. Although not every Archean would choose to journey through the starry sky, many did. None of them were able to conquer numerous other worlds like Sima Nan had done back when there were no other Archeans. However, they were very excited to travel the stars and visit new places. Eventually, a second Archean felt a calling within his soul, and found the same location as Sima Nan. His appearance was dramatically different from Sima Nan's. He looked almost like an enormous boulder. However, as soon as he saw the statue of Bai Xiaochun, he also trembled, and began to offer worship. Eventually, a third Archean came, and then a fourth. Eventually, more than 20 found Bai Xiaochun's statue. And soon, from that very location, myths regarding the most ancient of times began to spread through the starry sky. As more and more worlds learned of Bai Xiaochun, increasing numbers of cultivators began to study the ancient records, in which they found descriptions of a history long past. As cultures made contact with each other, and shared knowledge, they were shocked to find that similar myths were present everywhere in the starry sky. The sun god, the moonlight immortal, the creator, the wind spirit, the stone ancestor, the almighty. As the peoples of the starry sky came to realize the true name behind all of the titles of their deities, it led to a storm of astonishment. God actually exists. He created our world, and life itself. It was him. He founded the cultivation world. The legends and myths were turning out to be reality, causing a massive uproar in the cultivation world. More Archean experts began to make the pilgrimage to the statue of Bai Xiaochun, to bask in its light, and to experience the holy aura of the area. Eventually, it was considered a great honor to be able to travel to that land. At the same time, Bai Xiaochun earned a new title, Origin of the Starry Sky. The wonderment of myth becoming reality did not fade with the passage of years. Eventually, Sima Nan passed away, as did all of the original Archeans who had discovered Bai Xiaochun and stood guard over him. A new generation of Archeans came, following the call within their souls, hoping to draw closer to God. They also chose to stand guard over Bai Xiaochun. However, not all living beings have the same temperament, personality, and way of thinking. Among the 1,080,000 worlds, there were some powerful experts who did not feel reverence for Bai Xiaochun. Some wished to usurp him. Kill God, and we can become immortal divinities. That became the new focus and obsession of many. Years later, as the Archeans grew stronger and more powerful, a sovereign finally appeared within the starry sky. Sovereigns existed on a completely different and higher level than Archeans, so as soon as one appeared, it shook the very fabric of the starry sky. Furthermore, this sovereign was not interested in peace. And therefore, the people he encountered had two choices: submit to new rulership, or die in the flames of war. After subjugating the majority of the starry sky, the sovereign's subjects were as vast as the grains of sand in a sea. And at that point, he made a decision. He traveled to the very center of the starry sky, to that legendary hallowed land, where he stood in front of the statue of Bai Xiaochun, and challenged him to a fight to the death. It was an event that was profoundly shocking to all of the various peoples who inhabited the starry sky. And yet, before anyone could travel to watch the battle be fought, it was over. The Archean experts who were standing guard in the hallowed land at the time were able to record the battle in jade slips. Those images were later spread among cultivators, all of whom were flabbergasted by what they saw, and were prompted to immediately drop to the ground and offer obeisance in the direction of the hallowed land. The images in the jade slips showed that sovereign flying like a meteor toward the statue, radiating the power of essence, causing everything around him to shake violently. As he neared the statue of Bai Xiaochun, the statue didn't even move. And yet, the sovereign crumbled into pieces, erased out of existence, leaving absolutely nothing behind. No one knew what level of power could do something like this, and thus, they simply called it the power of God. And no one dared to challenge the power of God. More years passed, and the starry sky entered an age of sovereigns. The story of God wiping a sovereign out of existence became a legend, and the will of the numerous worlds in the starry sky gave approval for more cultivators to become sovereigns. Eventually, a sovereign appeared amongst the other sovereigns, who was supremely powerful, and whose Tao differed from all other sovereigns. He devoured other entities, almost like a black hole, and eventually, he became the second cultivator to challenge God. He sought to devour God, and thus become a god himself. The guardians of the hallowed land of the statue were shocked, but could do nothing to stop him. They could only watch as the most powerful sovereign of the era strode toward the mountain on which the statue stood, his hands clasped behind his back. God, I believe in your existence, but even more so, I believe that you are a relic of the past. Who cares that you've existed down to this day? Instead of sticking around uselessly, why not become a stepping stone for me? He slowly strode up to the top of the mountain, which was when he suddenly shivered. Breath sticking in his throat, he tried to take a step back, but before he could, he simply faded out of existence. All of the surrounding guardians were shocked. Deathly silence resulted. This challenge to God had played out exactly like the legend of the first sovereign who had challenged him. Then, to the complete astonishment of the guardians, the statue opened its eyes. Simultaneously, the multitude of suns that filled the starry sky blazed with unheard-of radiance, and the moons sparkled more dazzlingly than ever. The living beings that populated the 1,080,000 worlds were shaken to the core as they then heard a warm yet ancient voice speaking to them. How careless of me. With a stir of will, let tribulation appear. In response to the words, everything in the starry sky that contained essence or magical law stirred. A new thought seemed to enter all minds, and within the vast starry sky, a new natural law came into being. It was the natural law of heavenly tribulation. Henceforth, heavenly tribulation existed, and any who challenged it were essentially challenging Bai Xiaochun. Bai Xiaochun did not reject challenges, and yet, wanted to seek enlightenment and peace. In conjunction with his words, the guardians who stood watch around his statue vanished, reappearing in the worlds that they came from. In that instant, all descriptions and recollections regarding Bai Xiaochun that existed within the various ancient records faded away. From then on, Bai Xiaochun did not exist within the histories of any of the peoples of the starry sky. The hallowed land of the statue also disappeared, never again to be discovered by any cultivators. From that point on, the peoples of the starry sky developed on their own. People still arose who challenged the heavens, but the legends of Bai Xiaochun and the myths of the origin of the starry sky were eventually forgotten. Time continued to slip by. Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.